I'm curious. So I tried something new here. I turned on closed caption, and I'm curious if you all are seeing that at least in English at the bottom. So then I'm curious for folks in other countries if you have the capability to view that in, I don't think it will translate. I'm trying to see if it would. I'm just kind of curious. Um, yeah, I don't think it translates. That would be cool. Maybe next year, Zoom will get on it and it'll translate. That would be wicked awesome. Because my Spanish is not so great anymore, and I definitely don't speak anything else. Like I may understand like two words in Japanese, one word in German. All right. So speaking of languages, I do have a few slides for today, which is a little different than what we normally do, but I think it'll give us a foundation for conversation. I'll upload those slides today, and then what I found out this morning is that the week wasn't released. So I will do that after our class today. Um, hey, Matt, you're in Colorado Springs, right? Not um, Boulder.
I'm just outside of Boulder, but I am good.
Okay. I just wanted to check to make sure you were okay.
Appreciate it.
All right. So cultural competency, I love this topic because we have such a global classroom, and yet as a white person in the United States, it's a very um, not a difficult conversation, but also one in which recognize that there's so much more than say an American, again, white perspective um, to a global classroom. So just want to bring up a few topics, and I actually took a lot of this out of um, my own global leadership class in um, in my PhD program to get kind of basic terms and other kind of foundational pieces in cultural competency when it relates to leadership. And then one question at the end. So it's only like 7 slides. So I'm going to pull those up and share my screen, and hopefully I get the right one. So, all
It's going good.
right. Let's see. There we go. All right, folks, want to give me a thumbs up. Let me see if I can see you again. Here we go. Awesome. Thank you. All right, so cultural competency. Again, just a few slides to set a foundation for conversation. And so some key terms that I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page with. Intercultural interactions. And I think what you'll see with a lot of these is they're very applicable even to our situation in a classroom here. So intercultural interactions, either one-on-one or small group conversations and points of conversation between folks that are of different cultures, just like our class meeting every week. Cultural humility. So that's what I try to sometimes practice in recognizing or being self-aware of an American perspective in a global classroom, and trying to be, per even just the word humility, of humble in one, being exposed to other cultures, and then two, kind of checking assumptions at the door is how we kind of view cultural humility. Leadership flexibility and leadership adaptability are, in my view, a little one and the same. But being able to adapt in the current situation, so things like giving more time for explanations or giving more room for language barriers, but also recognizing cultures use words in a different way or definitions in a different way, and adapting to that to be able to either lead a group or be part of a leadership structure, if you will. Cultural intelligence is more so of knowing things about the culture that you're either exposed to or working in, or just simply knowing more about the culture of another country or the culture of another group. Um, so making a distinction there between cultural intelligence and emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence really is very separate from cultural intelligence, and I'll actually show you a little bit of the difference. But emotional intelligence is more so recognizing, um, being socially aware, being or recognizing your own reactions to the situation personally, as opposed to from a cultural context. And I'm going to show you that kind of difference with cultural intelligence in a moment and break that down a little bit. Leadership effectiveness, more so in that piece. Yes, you can be flexible, but are you effective? Uh, do you promote other folks? Do you encourage and enable and empower those that you're working with in your role as a leader? And then one of my favorites, I think, is being a cultural chameleon. And for those of you that speak more than one language, before COVID, say, traveled frequently, uh, immerse yourself in another culture and take some of those aspects on, is what is considered a cultural chameleon. Um, I think a lot, so some of you that were in Peace Corps probably relate to this a little bit after you come back of you've adapted, right? I've adapted to the environment around me, changing my diet, changing or learning a language, wearing clothes that are from another culture as opposed to my own to fit in to the environment that I'm in. So hopefully all those definitions make sense and kind of guide our conversation around cultural competency. Okay, so we're going to test a little bit of cultural intelligence. So this is a little bit of engagement on your part. And so whether you want to share what your perspective would be versus what it actually is, please do. So especially for those of us that are in African countries, maybe you can give us some insights on this. So two Kenyan men holding hands. What is that? What does that mean when you see it? So in Kenya, if you see two men holding hands, what would that mean to you? Because to some of us, that would mean that they're dating. But is that what it means in Kenya?
I'm gonna just guess that they're just good friends.
All right.
Yeah, that's my guess. Like I know, even though Armenia was like super homophobic, I noticed guys would like. It was very common for guys that are like really close friends to like hold hands and like link up arms and like give each other a kiss on the face and greeting. And I would see that and think, oh, they're just a happy couple. But
Mm-hmm.
I know over there that it's just like it's just a good way to show affection. They're just holding hands. That's literally it. That'd be my
Casey?
guess.
Yeah. In Uganda, it's the same way. It is very common for men holding hands, not because obviously they were in a relationship, because a lot of time Uganda is very fast paced. And so if you're walking down the street and talking to your friend, you want to make sure that you're keeping up with each other. So you'll usually hold their hands while you're also talking and walking. Very common.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Any other perspectives? And feel free, if you aren't having a great connection, to come off of mute or put it in the chat if you don't have a great connection. That's what I was trying to say. If you'd like to share. So this is a little bit different of a question. How would, in a Southeast Asian context, how would it be taken if there was a proposed railway line going through your town? How would that be taken in the context of, say, a Southeast Asian country like Malaysia, Thailand? How would the local community respond? Or what's your guess of how would they respond? I think the closest we might have somebody would be Amir. Or let's see, Dorji's relatively close, but nobody's in a Southeast Asian country.
I have not much idea about railways because my country does not even have, metro
Well,
railway.
but you also live in a relatively rural country, right, Dorji?
Yes, that's true.
So if, let's say in Bhutan, let's say there was a proposal to put a railway through Bhutan, how would that be taken?
Well, it all depends on which generation of people you are. And for example, my generation will take it as a developmental activity, and people welcome that. And because you would definitely be jealous of some countries where people, because especially in China, what people do is they actually make tunnels through the mountains and make railway lines there. So we will definitely be jealous and say that, okay, we can also make, some kind of railway lines like China, because this is doable. Because until now, also railway lines are just above the ground, and it's not feasible in Bhutan because it's a mountainous country and there are no planes, almost no, we don't have any planes at all. But looking at the kind of developmental activities, especially the railway lines in China, you see in pictures and say that, okay, this is doable in Bhutan also.
Well, thank you for that perspective and bringing up the generational piece, and that yes, younger generations might consider it a great development. Amir, did you have something?
No, I don't have idea. We don't have a railway line. We have only very short 40 to 50-kilometer railway line in the Tarang area. So
So it might be different for you than, say, Bhutan.
yeah.
How about an Indian man shaking his head?
Yeah, we have. Nepal is a neighboring country of India, and our culture, and we have very similar in culture. And shaking hand means sometimes yes or sometimes no. If the man shaking like this is a no, and like this is yes.
Well, and I think it's also interesting. So, to kind of give an example of one of the tutors forever ago that I had hired for a tutoring program on campus was a international student, Indian, teaching or tutoring in math and chemistry. And in explaining concepts, he would nod or shake his head frequently, which was what he's used to and completely acceptable. However, an American freshman who also is failing her chemistry class took it very differently and did not understand his cultural context of that's completely appropriate, and then complained about his ability to tutor and that he was being demeaning and being overbearing in his explanation because of gestures, which was unfortunate how that all played out. But yeah, very acceptable cultural kind of reaction. And Fabienne mentioned a new generation will see a railway as development progress for the community, but for our older folks, they will see it as a way rich people find a way to become richer and make the poor poorer. Thank you for sharing that perspective. And last but not least, we don't have any folks that are in a Middle Eastern country, but I guess India and Pakistan and that area would be the closest. What happens if somebody doesn't show to a meeting or appointment in the Middle East? Anybody have that experience before? Maybe not so much. And Daniel explains that Indian man shaking his head in agreement, which is disagreement in Ethiopia. So don't shake your head if you're agreeing. So at least if somebody doesn't show up for an appointment in the Middle East, in some African countries, if they're later, that's culturally acceptable. Even if somebody, say 2 o'clock and they show up at 4, that is culturally acceptable. So, oops. All right, so thank you for contributing to that conversation and sharing a little bit of what you all have experienced. I want to go through some competencies of a global leader. So we've mentioned open and flexible, adaptable, asking questions, I think is a big one there too, in trying to understand. Not only to manage conflicts, but to manage a conflict in a way that you understand how conflicts are kind of couched in a particular context. You know, what we might say disagree with in the States, or how we share that we disagree, could be completely different in another country, and the ability for a leader to manage those 2 different situations is what will make them more competent. Willing to re-examine or examine their assumptions, their attitudes towards other people, their perceptions. So just like the example of, we say 2 Kenyan men, but for a lot of African countries, that's acceptable. So from, like, say, an American perspective, I might have assumed that they were dating. Well, for me to have a better kind of global competency, I need to, one, understand what that means in a context of, say, that community, but check myself in terms of why I perceive or why I have an ingrained perception about seeing 2 men holding hands. But also a global leader can manage rapid change, and meaning, say, either development of a local community, change in terms of the people that you are working with, but can cope, right? They can adapt to things as they change. They promote trust. They share a little bit of vulnerability when they don't understand something and ask questions, but also are very respectful of other people that are different than them. And last but not least, lead through influence, in terms of influencing people who are different. So how a global leader, say, approaches either individuals that are peers, or, say, individuals that are in an organizational scale, say subordinates, or those that work for them, how they influence those people are going to be very different depending on their understanding and cultural context. So just 6 competencies, and that's really based on, and I've cited some of this here, based on research, based off of the International Leadership Association's understanding of the basic competencies of a global leader. And I'm kind of curious, from all of those competencies, if there is a particular person that comes to mind when you see those? When you see those competencies, is there a particular person that comes to mind? Whether we know them or not, if you'd like to share. Is there somebody that embodies all of these things? Even if it's a friend or a colleague, not necessarily someone on an international stage. Or on the opposite side, somebody that's completely not a global leader, that is complete opposite of these competencies.
I guess, I mean, my, the leader that I interviewed, is that cheating? The person that I interviewed for that one, Eugenie, honestly, kind of came to mind. She did a lot of studying abroad, and then also, last time that I was in Armenia, she was actually leaving to go to Germany for a conference. So she goes to lots of conferences, and I don't know, in general, she always was able to answer a lot of the questions that I had that I was like too embarrassed to ask my language instructors. But then at the same time, she would still ask me, like, I don't know, just random questions about American culture, or she was at that time dating someone who was from America and would say, hey, I know my culture believes this way, but he said something, and I'm just wondering, like, am I interpreting it the wrong way because of my culture, or like as my opinion based off of American culture? So like she understands there's definitely cultural differences, and like we'll try to ask questions so that she understands the situation more instead of being offended. Like she's like, I know that I would be offended in this case based off of my culture, but I know that American culture is different. So I want to ask your opinion, see what you say, so I can have a better understanding.
Very cool. Anyone else, when you see these competencies, that someone comes to mind? So I will say this is kind of a little back in the day with the United Nations, and if any of you remember Kofi Annan, or some people would say Kofi Annan. He was, oh gosh, I forget the title of the head of the UN, but someone that was very adaptable, very open and frank in conversations. And English was not his first language, obviously, but I think he was a very beloved leader of the UN that was more so remembered, I think, than other leaders of the UN. Just someone that I interpreted as very much a global leader. And I would guess that if you're going to head up the United Nations, you should be a global leader. But he's just one that really stuck out to me over the years. It probably helped that I met the man, but just someone with staying power who was able to, in a context in which you have somebody representing every country and trying to promote agreement or consensus, where that's very difficult. You know, we've got, I think, what was it, 140 countries or something like that are part of the UN to get agreement, and he managed to do that. Any other folks that come to mind with a global leader? They don't have to be in your country. They don't have to be someone that you know. No examples? All right. So I mentioned cultural intelligence. So you've probably heard of IQ, so intellectual competence, or how we measure intelligence with an IQ, and then EQ, so emotional intelligence, and then there is cultural intelligence, or CQ. So if you have high cultural intelligence, this is the basic definition of a high cultural intelligence leader. So when we look at just the basic definition, a person who is able to adapt to new cultural settings by learning what the rules, norms, and practices are of a culture, and being motivated to engage with people in that culture, and therefore behaving appropriately and executing efficiently in their leadership responsibilities, is more likely to be successful than one who is not. So that is the kind of foundational definition of a high cultural intelligence leader. Is there anything that surprises you there, um, or something in that definition that you recognize in yourself that you either have or are trying to develop? Or want to give an example of how you were in a new cultural setting and how you adapted?
What does the Q stand for?
So it really doesn't actually stand for anything other than intelligence. So like there's IQ, EQ, CQ. So it goes off the whole like IQ. It's an intelligent quotient is what it originally stood for, but anymore people have forgotten the quotient part of it, and so they've just used intelligence to sub for that, if you will. So CQ is cultural intelligence, EQ is emotional intelligence. And Daniel, to answer your question, are EQ and CQ a subset of IQ? No, it's they're very separate. Um, they're very separate concepts. So whenever we think of how intelligent someone is, we think about an IQ score, which is, I guess, easier to measure, if you will, as opposed to EQ and CQ. There are like measures, there are surveys that you can take about yourself to measure your EQ or cultural intelligence as well. But it's just very different than IQ, which has been kind of a standard for measuring intelligence, at least in the US. I don't know how much of that's really used abroad. But they are not the same, and they're not a subset of the other.
I think another good thing to remember is that um, in terms of culture, it doesn't always have to be international cultures that you're dealing with, but also culture of just really any given area outside of your own culture. Like when I first went to school, I moved to a really small town called Eastman in like middle Georgia, and it's definitely very different than living in a city because I lived in Atlanta for a good amount of time, where we have such a large, diverse, like international population. And then moving to Eastman, where it was not very, it wasn't a very diverse community. So it was a culture that was different than my own. And so like when I moved there, I kind of had to like learn that culture. And one thing I started doing actually was volunteering at like local organizations to learn more about the people and then also to work with them. And also, I really had nothing to do. There's really nothing to do there um, at all. So I just go straight into volunteerism.
Yeah, and I think you're correct in that, June, in saying that EQ and CQ do have a lot of similarities, especially with kind of self-assessment, being self-aware in how you interact with folks that are different than you. I think, and several like European friends have mentioned this before, in that they're amongst their networks that are also European. There are a lot of folks that don't understand why Americans in general don't travel to other countries. And a lot of that, when you think about it, within 50 states, there are so many different cultures among 50 states. And some people consider the US as having kind of 50 different countries, if you will, because they are so different. Different in like norms, and different in what's acceptable, different from how people interact with each other, different in like food, and different in politics. And so it's sometimes within the US alone, having cultural intelligence moving from one state to another can be very interesting. So even going from like, say, Kentucky to California, there's a lot of cultural changes in that. Going from like, say, Hawaii to Maine, again, very different. It doesn't even have to be across the country. Going from Kentucky to Tennessee, or going from Utah into Wyoming, very kind of different. And then even regionally. So there's, I think, sometimes even within the US alone, a cultural context that shifts state to state. And I'm sure several of you moving from like within a region, so like of what might be very similar. Same thing, moving within states, there's a lot that is very similar, but also very different. So I think that CQ concept has many different ways of looking at it, not just like by countries, not just by regions and states. There's a lot of different ways that could be interpreted in how you use it. With this cultural intelligence and leadership piece, are there parts of it at all that you think are harder in becoming a leader in a global context?
I think it's difficult to know. I guess this is sort of another question, maybe not the answer. But do you think, like, if we're looking at leaders within our communities, would they be considered a good leader if they are aware that they're not, like, you don't know other cultures, but they might at least be able to acknowledge that, and then like being open to learn?
Absolutely.
Or would it be also like encouraging their communities to be more culturally sensitive, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's both, Grace. I think, yeah, especially when someone has been put into a leadership role, say someone who is an assigned leader, into a community that they're not as familiar with or exposed to, they may not have, say, the cultural intelligence of the context, but at the same time are very willing to learn it. And that does make a difference. And as opposed to like someone who is in the same situation and just chooses to plow through and do things the way they think they should be done without being sensitive to what the culture is, not wanting to learn, not wanting to adapt. So it makes them culturally adept or lacking in cultural intelligence. And thank you for sharing, Daniel and Austin. Yeah, I think making the effort to learn is really what is helpful in terms of building cultural competence and cultural intelligence. So when we look at global leadership. So throwing one more angle at you all before I have a final question for you all for the conversation here. Global leadership is, and this is again defined by some literature and research, being capable of operating effectively in a global environment while being respectful of cultural diversity, can manage accelerating change and differences, is open and flexible in approaching others, can cope with situations, so they can manage feelings, they can manage themselves with situations and people from disparate from his or her background, so different than his or her background, and is willing to re-examine and alter personal attitudes and perceptions. So very similar to what we saw here, right? Or very similar, of changing attitudes, perceptions, and being accepting and open and learning. So being that open and flexible, Austin, you make a great point there, is that even when things are confrontational or difficult, or somebody is still seen as an outsider, at least asking questions and approaching things from a learning perspective, I think brings with it some respect for that leader. So certainly parts and pieces of this we can work on. There may be, if we go back to these competencies, I think some of what might be the hardest for a lot of people is that managing conflict. So even if you take it out of, say, a global context, people don't like conflict in general. They don't like to disagree with others or admit that they disagree, or they just kind of hold it in, keep it in until something kind of just bursts. They can't take it anymore and they lash out. And I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces that takes a lot of work on all of our parts, is to manage conflict. So all of these things, leading to cultural intelligence and cultural competencies and global leadership. Yes, controversy with civility. I don't have to agree with you, but I at least have to respect your perspective, right? So I'm sure many of you have examples of where you've disagreed with somebody but said, you know what, we're going to agree to disagree and move on. And then that will influence decisions that you have to make. So at least when you can't agree, you take in at least the other person's perspective, and you know what it is, as opposed to them not sharing it. So then I want to ask kind of implications for you. What should you do in your own context for your own development as a leader to be as prepared as possible for current or future career goals, or that doesn't necessarily always mean employment, maybe a volunteer role, but based on those competencies, based on the conversation that you all have had, what are some of the things that you might look to do to be prepared to be a global leader and to have higher cultural intelligence? I'm going to actually take that question and put it in the chat box, and then stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other. So what's kind of the one thing that you want to, or maybe several, that you want to do or change or learn about yourself and the implications, kind of like how you develop as a culturally competent leader?
Okay. I think maybe I just want to learn, or I just need to learn to trust myself a little bit more. I feel like a lot of these things that we're talking about, like I feel like I definitely definitely relate to in terms of like being flexible, being understanding, and having like a dash of empathy in there. Um, I do also have the idea that if you are working with another culture internationally, it definitely helps to learn the language, not just for a communicative standpoint, but also language and culture are so interwoven together that like learning the language in that area, you start to learn a little bit of the culture. Um, but at least for, I guess, like internationally speaking, maybe not so much if you are, uh, I guess, talking about cultures within your own country that still speak the same language. But I guess just like trust myself more that I know the knowledge that like I know like I have these experiences and I like I know this information and just like lead with that knowledge, I guess, that I have this already and just believe in myself.
Thank you for sharing. So, what would you want to do, or maybe a different way of phrasing this? Is there something within your own development, say in the next year, that you want to try or experience or do to build your cultural intelligence to be more culturally competent? Other than being in this program, which I think exposes you to a lot of different cultures, right?
Can I just say travel? I want to travel.
Yeah. When it's safe to travel again.
When it's safe to travel again, I would like to travel. I sorely miss having these engaging conversations with people outside of my own culture and thought patterns that like I'm dying here. So yes, I want to travel. That I think that would definitely help out a little bit.
It does. I think travel's a huge one. Anybody else can't wait to travel?
I struggle with identifying what is cultural and what is people's personalities or styles. I think even in contexts like this class, it's something I want to balance, like how often I'm listening and how often I'm talking. And I don't know if anyone has experienced that, even just in this class, like thinking like, okay, I am comfortable sharing right now, or like I'd rather listen and hear from other cultures, or like I feel like this applies to me. This is one of the few like intercultural experiences I'm having right now. So yeah, I think that's something to keep practicing my own balance in this context.
Thanks for sharing. So Casey's doing webinars and Austin's trying to learn Spanish.
I think for me, just acknowledging that like differences in cultures don't have to be across seas, but they could be like across the street in a different neighborhood or a different city within 10-mile radius. Especially with, I live in Louisville and I work in Longmont, and there's a good 15 miles in between, but they're not the same. So keeping that in mind also.
How about food? Do you all see like trying different kinds of food? Fabienne's gonna improve her English and Spanish, be more of an extrovert. So you do have to put yourself out there. But I think there's also a little bit of that humility in recognizing you don't know what you don't know until somebody tells you. Like, that's not appropriate, or here's what we do, like in my culture, here's what we don't do. Um, Right. So yeah, being a chameleon, that one's hard for me. So like, where's the line between being a cultural chameleon and cultural appropriation? That one is difficult. Carlene, did you have something?
Yeah, so that's something that we deal with a lot in my work. We work um, on indigenous land, Alaska Native, the unceded territory of the Tlingit and Haida community. And often, in my office, we are primarily white. And, we're working on things like our land acknowledgement, something to say before all of our meetings. And a lot of it is just reaching out to the community and saying, how can we do better? And knowing that we don't have all the answers. So being willing to learn and to make that reach.
The Canadians are like brilliant at that. With a lot of their meetings and like recognize, like before every meeting, recognizing which tribe the land belonged to and showing respect. Yeah, the Canadians are brilliant for that. So yeah, I have a hard time with like the difference between being a cultural chameleon and cultural appropriation. Like I have like several outfits, like even from other Girl Scout organizations in different countries that were either like gifted to me or were like traded or things like that for like an American style outfit. So I have like a dress from Ethiopia. I have a hanbok from Korea and a couple other outfits. And then things have changed in such a way where I feel like I can't wear those in public for, say, an event, or well, definitely not right now with COVID, without somebody thinking that I wear that or own that outfit because I thought it was cool or I thought it was like fun looking, when I'm like, no, like my cousin's Korean and this was gifted to me, and my I had friends in Ethiopia with Girl Scouts, like, so there is like a weird hard line of like, am I playing a part where I'm concerned about what other people would think of me when I know full well that's not what I'm doing, but I'm worried about the perception of other people thinking that I'm trying to culturally appropriate by wearing an outfit. So that's been my latest like mind debacle on that one. So any others that you all are kind of the skill sets that you're trying to build or try things that would increase your cultural competence? I want to leave it open for what people are doing and sharing. And you can also put it in the chat. So thank you all for engaging here with this. So a lot of folks are doing different things. I think, any others that you all want to share? I think the biggest thing is to ask questions and come from a place of humility and humbleness to say, I want to know more about this and I don't know, and I need your help in explaining something. I think one of the biggest moments in just trying to understand more is some friends of mine, like back in college. So this has been quite some time, but several of us went to and visited a mosque with one of our friends. She was going to the mosque for their regular service, and so my biggest question was, I can't remember if I shared this before, why do women pray behind the men, like as a group? So men pray in the front, women pray in the back. And from an like feminist female perspective from the US, I'm like, this is unequal and this is wrong. I don't understand why women are behind the men and why they, like, husband and wives aren't praying like together or families together. It's separated by gender. And so I just flat out said, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? And they're like, well, you've seen how we pray, right? I'm like, yes, very much kind of understand that point. They're like, so as a woman, if you're praying in the way that a Muslim prays, would you want somebody staring at your rear end that was of the opposite gender? And I'm like, definitely not. So thank you for explaining some of that. I mean, there are other like cultural contexts to that as well, but that was kind of one of the biggest explanations for them to at least start to explain to me why women and men pray separate, maybe sometimes in different rooms depending on the building. So that was more so of me asking the questions and admitting I don't know what I don't know, and can you please explain something to me? Yes, thank you. Safety first to women. Yeah, it's interesting how that is perceived in so many different contexts. So, Grace, you had something to share too?
Yeah, I wanted to say, building off of what you and Daniel both just mentioned, I think that can finding similarities or like appreciations between cultures like help us better understand the nuances and like celebrate the differences, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Recognizing differences and celebrating has a lot of value, definitely. And it doesn't always necessarily have to be strictly on a country basis or a religious basis either. So thank you all for the conversation. I'm going to open working with Kelly to open up this week because there's a chapter that I placed in Moodle. So it will be open. I'll email everybody when that is fixed. It's from a really great book. The chapter is developing leadership diversity, and it not only covers like cultural context, there's a good chunk of it that's on global diversity and social value systems and developing cultural intelligence, but also a gender-based perspective as well from this book, The Leadership Experience. So that will be released for you all today when I fix it as well. So it's part of just reading for the week. If you will look through that chapter, there's not like a requirement there, but I think would very much influence more of your perspective on building your cultural intelligence. So we will be back here next week for the last time before spring break, if I've got that correct. Let me flip through real quick. See, today's the 23rd. So yeah, we have class next week on the 30th. And then the week after that is spring break. So we'll see you all back here on Tuesday at 9:30 Eastern time. So thank you all for great conversation, sharing, engaging in the chat. And thank you all for the perspectives you bring. Have a good day, everybody.